Welcome, everybody. On behalf of Holocaust Museum LA, my name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am pleased to welcome you to our discussion with Leah Ratziner, Holocaust survivor from the Netherlands. Before we begin, I would like to share a few words about the museum. Holocaust Museum LA is the first Holocaust survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust, and this memorial eventually became Holocaust Museum LA. These survivors did so at a time when the community was by and large not yet ready to face this tragic history. Thanks to their courage and their foresight, these survivors established the first Holocaust museum in the United States with the mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Furthermore, our museum should always be free to the public, making Holocaust education accessible to everyone. Even though we are not able to be in our museum's physical space for the time being, we are able to still carry forward their mission on a daily basis. This morning, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Leah Ratziner, who will share her story with you. After Leah shares her story, you can type in questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and those watching on Facebook can type in questions in the comments, and Leah will answer as many questions as possible. Leah has been sharing her story at the museum for several years now, and she has participated in just about all of our educational programs over the years, and she has done a lot for students in our community and for our museum community in general by sharing her story and in participating in our educational programs. And Leah, it is such an honor to welcome you this morning. Thank you so much for being with us and speaking.
Thank you, Michael, and thank the museum for making this possible. And I thank all of you listeners for listening to these stories that are so important. My name is Leah Ratziner, and I was born in the Netherlands, in actually Amsterdam, the day after Kristallnacht, which was the night of the broken glass in Germany, when they destroyed lots of stores and temples in Germany. My parents were both from Poland. My father came in the late 20s, probably, or early 30s. He came to the Netherlands. He had a brother, and this is important in the story later on. He had a brother, an older brother. Both of them were tailors, and his brother came to the Netherlands indirectly by way of Argentina. He had been in Germany and then went to Argentina. And the reason is Argentina is important because he had some problems, and as luck would have it, during his stay there, which was probably not longer than a year, he became an Argentine citizen, which is important. So my father lived in Poland still. They came from the city of Lodz. And life was very difficult in Poland, and not only because of there were a lot of anti-Semitism, but there was also, the same as in the United States, there was a depression and life was very difficult. My uncle, meanwhile, was, of course, in the Netherlands, had married, and after working hard, had started a business there and had a store. And he said to his brother, why don't you join me here in the Netherlands? I think your life will be better. So he came to the Netherlands, started, in the beginning, he started working with his brother, and slowly he his business grew and he was able to open up a store. And he got older, of course. Meanwhile, it was mid-30s. And like all minorities in all countries, the United States, the same thing. You stay with people that are similar. And his friends were all Polish, and he wanted to get married. But the community, the Polish community in those days was small. So he decided to go back to Poland and look for a wife. And meanwhile, my mother was in Poland, in Lodz, and she was an orphan. Her father had died during the Spanish flu. Her mother had died when she was about 14, and she lived alone there. Life was very difficult. So when she heard that there was someone looking for a wife, she thought that that was the way to get out of Poland, where it was so difficult for her. They met in Lodz, and my mother was very beautiful, and he loved, the idea that he could have her. He returned, and I never received any wedding documents, so I don't even know where they got married. He returned. By then, like I said, it must be in the mid-30s. He returned to Holland or the Netherlands, and she followed a year later. And she helped him, and eventually they were able to open a store in the city of Amsterdam. By then he had a store, and this is a picture of the store. It's coming. And they lived upstairs. It was in a building. Downstairs was the store, and upstairs were the living quarters. We had a housekeeper, and my mother was able to go downstairs to help during the day, and the housekeeper would take care of me. I need help. Oh. Sorry about that. It's coming.
It's okay. That's
it's
okay.
Coming. There it is. So this is a picture. We lived upstairs. This was on the street. In the Netherlands, they did not have ghettos as such, but there were Jewish neighborhoods. This was not, I don't think it was even in the Jewish neighborhood. And we lived upstairs there. There's a picture of my mother before I was born with my father. Now, if you see my father, so they sold, let me tell you about the store. They sell fabrics, and a person would go there and be measured, and then they would make a suit for you. In those days, most people had their suits made to order, and he would have some workers there by now. And that's how it looked. Now, I have a picture that was taken after I was born. I was born the day after Kristallnacht. Here you see my father, mother, and myself. And you can see, if you look at the picture, that my mother was lighter and didn't have the Semitic features that my father, myself, and later my sister had. And in the Netherlands, in those days, more so than now, people, you could tell Jewish people how they looked. We looked different from the Dutch people. They were very blonde and light. So normally that made no difference because there was absolutely no anti-Semitism in the Netherlands or Amsterdam. Most of the Jews in the Netherlands lived in Amsterdam. That's where the majority lived. And there were about 140,000 plus Jews living in the Netherlands. And most of those were in Amsterdam. So life proceeded in the Netherlands. This is important too, and that had started already in the mid-30s, and they had started public records, and the Germans, the Nazi, participated in that. And they had records of all the inhabitants in the Netherlands, not only Jews. And it told where every person lived, sort of like a census, except they also would ask how many people lived in the family, where they came from, what religion, and all the information. So that made it later on, unbeknownst to us, it made it easier for the Germans. Now life went on. My mother was happy there. My father, it was a good marriage. Most of the friends, like I said, were Polish. And in 1940, I should also say, that I should say first that in the Netherlands, that when my father and mother came, and in the late 30s, already when the Nazis, when Hitler came to power in Germany, there already people knew that would probably be a war, but they always thought the Netherlands would be all right, because during World War I, the Netherlands had stayed neutral, so did Sweden, and so did Switzerland, and the Netherlands too. So people thought that by going to the Netherlands, they were free. But in 1940, May of 1940, the Germans decided to invade the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the north of France and the coast of France. And partly that was so that they could, they wanted to conquer England, and that would be easier from any of the coastal areas. So the war started when they first bombed the city of Rotterdam. The reason they chose Rotterdam was there's a big port and they were going to destroy the port. Unfortunately, they also destroyed the city. The planes made some mistakes. And a lot of the people, regular Dutch people, including Jews, died and didn't have housing. So when the war started, there were a lot of refugees also, especially children, that didn't have housing. So a lot of the children, even though they were not Jewish, also needed places, which later on was a convenient excuse when they had to place children. You say, oh, these children were homeless because of the bombing in Rotterdam, and we need housing for them. So they didn't necessarily all have to be Jewish. And after the Germans invaded, after they bombed it, the Dutch capitulated after 5 days. The Queen and the royal court disappeared and went to England, and the princesses went to Canada, and it was the Dutch. There were a lot of sympathizers, and the Dutch government was ruled through the Germans, and they were all Nazis. They all believed in the Nazi cause. Now, by that time, in 41, you already were not allowed to go on trams. A lot of things were forbidden, and people started wearing the star. And every country had a star, but in Holland, it would say Jew in Dutch, and in France, it would say the same thing in French, or in Germany, it would be in Germans, and so on. But life proceeded, and they still could do things. Now, in 1941, the beginning of 41, there had been a big commotion, I can't think of the word. And in any case, they were fighting against Nazis. It was a group of people that was supporting the Nazis, and the Nazis in reprisal, because whatever would happen in in all over the parts where the Nazis, where the soldiers, where the Nazis were in charge, they always would punish the Jews. So this was the first real reprisal against the Jews they had. Before that, it was unpleasant, but life went on. On a certain Sunday, my sister was born the 8th of January, 1941. And 6 weeks later, it was a Sunday morning, my father said to my mother, they had planned a luncheon for my aunt and uncle to show the baby. And my father said that morning, I have to go into the city and I'll be back in time for lunch. So my father left, everything was normal. But what he didn't know is that because the Germans had decided to have a reprisal that day in the middle of the city, and I don't know how many of you know Amsterdam, it's a city with canal and drawbridges. They went into the Jewish quarter, which is where my father went that day to do some shopping for fabrics and supplies that he needed that day. And the Germans decided to bring up the drawbridges. And if you know Amsterdam, then you know that you cannot escape unless you know someone where you're walking that you know and you can go into their house, you're stuck. So suddenly all the drawbridges went up and the soldiers appeared, SS and Dutch sympathizers, and they called that a razzia. It was like a raid, and this was the first one in the city of Amsterdam. Later, there was a second one in June, and eventually they were in other parts of the country too. And they took men between the ages of 17 and 35. Now, my father fitted in that category. He was a young man and a lot of young students, and they were all Jewish. And they arrested like around 400 young men. They took them and they took them to a camp that was near the sea in the Netherlands. They had to undress, and they had this paper that each person, they wrote down who they arrested, who the wife was, and then they had to undress and tell exactly what they gave him. You know, they had paperwork, and if he had a watch, it says how much, if there was money, and that, of course, they were going to give this all back. The men that were arrested, these students and young husbands, had no idea what was happening. And they were a few days in that camp, and then they went to another one, and they eventually ended up in Mauthausen. This was done afterwards, because you can see it says Mauthausen there. And they, after about 10 months, they were all gone there. There was a quarry there, they were all killed. It was killed not just with a bullet or a gas chamber, no, they were cruel, and they waited. They didn't give them food, and they made them work in the quarry till they all died. Now, my mother, meanwhile, was in Amsterdam, left with two little children, 1 year old. No, she wasn't like a half-year-old, and 2.5. Oh, this is the list of all the people that died, and it has the name of my father, and it tells you exactly when he died. And we now know that they all died, and the Germans were fantastic in keeping records. My mother went back to the Germans and said, and all those other people too, and they said, well, where's my husband or son? And they didn't have answers. Eventually they came to her, or they told her to appear, and they gave her a piece of paper where it said that your husband died of heart attacks. And they all died of heart attacks or things like that. But we know that that was not true. So my mother, meanwhile, was left with the two of us. And here we are. This was when she was alone. And she, in the beginning, she went on, she had help in the store and she was able to manage. But then in July in 42, it started to be that people started getting notices because the Germans, meanwhile, they were thinking, what should we do with all these Jews? And that's for all of Europe. And you couldn't go anywhere because no other country wanted you. So the Germans started writing letters to the Jews or telling them first orally to tell them that that you couldn't stay in the country where you were, if it was in France, Belgium, or Holland, but that they have room for you in the East, Poland, or around there, Ukraine, and that they would have places where they would build towns where the Jews could work and have their own communities. Now, my mother, remember, she came from Poland, and she was used to anti-Semitism, and she never believed anything like that. And of course, she discussed with her brother-in-law, my uncle, and said, what should we do? What do I do? And some people actually did go to the train station. They said, oh, you can come this and this time and bring your backpack and come, and then you take this and this train and you can go. And believe it or not, people did go, and none of those people ever came back. So my mother talked it over with my uncle, and she decided that she was not going to go because their object of the Germans was that all the Jews, there were going to be no Jewish people left. It was going to be Judenrein, which means we cleanse it of Jews. So my mother said, well, I'm not doing what they tell me. I somehow will escape. But she knew that was the way my sister and I looked, that if she escaped anywhere and people would see us, they would know right away that we were Jews. So she asked the housekeeper, would she keep my sister till the war was ended? And in those days, they thought, well, just like during World War I, they thought this is going to be a little nothing, and before you know it, I'll be back. Well, it didn't work that way. So my sister, the housekeeper, said yes, and she took my sister, and my uncle took me. And I wasn't happy to lose my mother, that she was going away, but I was okay with that because I knew my aunt and uncle and cousins, and I liked it. So my mother, her idea was she would escape from Holland to Belgium, Belgium to France, and then she met with some other people that she knew in the city of Lyon, which was in southern France, very filled with Nazis at that time. And she was going to escape to Switzerland. You hire, just like in California, you have coyotes, only they called it something else. And she escaped to Switzerland. She had to walk over the mountains. And that's the whole story of her in itself. And she had to try 2 times to even make it into Belgium. But my mother was not a person to say no. And she made it eventually to Belgium and then on to Switzerland. I was with my aunt and uncle. My aunt and uncle were free, and they could do all this work because they had an Argentine passport. Argentina in those days was a friend of the Nazis, so they didn't touch them. They were free. And my aunt actually worked for the underground and could do those things because she had that passport, and that's how I was able to be there. Living with my aunt, she let me play in the street with other kids. But as time went on, And I think that was the summer of 42. As time went on, my aunt decided that it was getting to be too dangerous because kids in the street started calling me a dirty Jew and other things like that, not pleasant. And my aunt thought to herself, well, the police, we might be free, but my little niece, Leah, will not be free, and they will catch her and take her. So before that, she got in touch with other people from the underground, and they took me and placed me in a house where they had many other children. And now thinking about it, I think that probably those people, and there were about 8 children there, and my aunt knew some of the other children. This was in Northern Holland. We were there, and probably they were then slowly through the underground place us with other families. But before it came that far, someone said that someone had found out that there were Jewish children in that house. So the next day, the Nazis were going to come and take all the children. But the family found out, and before, just in the nip of time that evening, the underground existed. Those were resistance people, and a lot of those underground people were university students that did not like what was happening in their country. They were upstanding citizens. So what you had in the country, where you had some people that really didn't like the Nazis and were going to fight and do something. Then you had the majority of people that probably were very good people, but were not going to get involved. And you had the people that were actually helping the government and helping the Nazis to conquer and do whatever the Nazis wanted. So when I was in that house and they found out that they were coming the next day, they took me and they brought me to another house and to another house and to another house. And I was in different places. However, all this that I've told you so far are all things that I've heard either from my mother or my aunt. And unfortunately now, and may that be a lesson for all of you, I never asked enough questions, especially to my aunt and uncle. They could have answered a lot of questions, but as it is, I got enough information. So after that, after I was taken from that first house, no one knew where exactly I went or how I went. We think it's possible because in the Netherlands, in those days, a lot of the children, or no, even grown-ups, like you would get a letter from the government, the SS, saying that you had to appear on this and that day at the Dutch Schouwburg. This was an old Jewish theater in Amsterdam, and that you had to appear there, and you would stay there for an amount of days till the train would come at a certain day and bring you to a camp on the east side, Westerbork, on the east side of the Netherlands. Now, the picture you see next to it, and there's a streetcar that runs between the two buildings, is a crash that was across the street of that theater, where they took the children, especially if the children were without parents, and they would put them there, and then the underground would come and take the children and try to place them in a safe place. Now, the people that came with the parents and a child, they would ask the mother, is there any chance you want us to take your child and try to place it with a hiding family? And a lot of the mother, understandably, said no, because they wanted to keep the child with them. But those children, unfortunately, all died eventually. But the ones where the parents allowed them to go to the crash, or children like me, and I don't know if I ever was in the crash, but it's possible that I ended up there. those children, the underground, were able to find hiding places. Now, the way it worked in the Netherlands, they had a few organizations, they were student groups, and there were some that were combined Amsterdam and Utrecht, and they had a whole smuggling system. And the way the smuggling worked is you had people, they looked at the children, and if the children looked like I did, and I told you already I looked dark and was Semitic looking, those children were placed and were brought to the south of the country. And they called them, and they would send a notification, we have 5 pounds of coffee. The dark-haired children were the coffee one. And if you went, and it happens that a lot of those children were brought either to the province of Limburg, northern part of Limburg, where there was a big organ, it's not that big, but more than other places where many children were placed. And then there were many that went to the north of the country in Friesland. And there went to blonde ones, like my husband, he used to be blonde. And when they would send children to the north, those were the 10 pounds of tea, let's say. So you had the coffee and the tea. And the students that worked on that was a big organization, very, very dangerous. And many of those, because it was, of course, totally illegal to do that, many of those people that did that kind of work were killed. Now, in my case, meanwhile, so I was, of course, the coffee. So I went to the south of the country, to Limburg. Meanwhile, they were organizing. In the south, it was mostly dark and they were Catholic. In the north, they were Calvinistic. In the north, the people were lighter. And in the dark, maybe in the south, maybe because it was closer to France and Belgium, and people were darker, so it was easier. You still could see we looked different, but not as much as if we had been in the north. So in the meantime, this organization worked with the churches. In the south, it was Catholic, and most of the people, especially during those days, they were very religious, and they would announce at church on Sundays, are there any people here who are willing to have a child? And they would say that children from Rotterdam. They didn't necessarily say they were Jewish, because remember, there were all these refugees also that needed housing from Rotterdam. So as it happens, there were this part of the country, Limburg, they were farms, not the kind of farms you have here. They were smaller in size. But so the people, my family had a farm where I ended up. They had a farm, and and this is the farmhouse they had. These pictures were taken, by the way, later on, years later. But as you can see, there was nothing there. On one side, there was woods. On the other side, a mile away, maybe was another farmhouse. So when you went along the road, you wouldn't see anything. There was a dirt road there. There was no electricity at the time, no running water, but that had nothing to do with the war. That's just how it was in those days. So the family was in church, and they said, is there any people here? Are there any people here that would like a child? These people were the 2 farmers that eventually became my hiding parents. They were in their probably early 40s, and they had 2, maybe a little older, and they had 3 children, 2 daughters in their early 20s and a son of 17. Now remember, later on, that son of 17 was also wanted by the Germans to work and help the war effort. So they said, yes, they would like a child and they would prefer a girl. So meanwhile, I was gone and I don't know how, where exactly, what houses, where I was, but I do remember that's the first time I have any recollection. I was on a train with about 6 other children, and there were 2 ladies that were with us. The train would stop every so often. Someone would get off with a child and come back without a child, because probably now I suppose someone was waiting for them, took the child, and they came up. Eventually, we came to this far town called Horst. Not quite a train station near there. And people were waiting for me. And was a group of, there was a whole group that had organized. This was the end of where all the children went. I was the last one to get off. And I don't know if it went right away, if it was a day later. They brought me to this house of the family Christians. And it was hard for me, but by then I already knew that I was a Jew. I understood very well that I was Jew. I was somewhat traumatized, very scared of everything. We were told, of course, always to behave and what to do. And we knew already that the Nazis, the Germans, were bad. And we knew we had to be good. How we were indoctrinated like that, I can't tell you, but we behaved. And the ones that did not behave, and I know of some survivors that didn't, it was much harder for them because the hiding families would return the child to the underground and find another house. And the more you moved around, the more dangerous it became. Now, the street you see there in front of the house, that was, of course, during a snowy winter, which they had this year. They had one, but normally it did not get that cold that often. So in the beginning, it was difficult, but the people were very good to me. They said that when I arrived there, my body was full of sores. I looked dirty, my shoes, I didn't have shoes that fitted. I was a total mess, but they, not only did they love having me there, but they started, one of the girls, the ladies, my hiding sisters, was a seamstress, and they took old clothing and made new one for me. And somehow they were able to try to trade food for shoes for me, and they were able to provide for me. And slowly, by then, I had already been gone from my family for some time. We think it was in the autumn of 42, but even that I cannot tell you. And there are no records at all because no one wanted to keep any records of anything. It was too dangerous. So, but I got adjusted. I loved living there. I even started speaking the dialect. They speak a dialect there. And I felt totally at home, and that was my home. However, they had worked with me beforehand and told me, you know, something could happen and they might come to look for you if they find out that we have a Jewish child there. By that time, I must have been 4 years old, 3.5, 4 years old. And they told me that in the living room, in those houses, there's always a room that's the living room where you never go unless it's a super holiday. And they had this cabinet there. Now, this picture also was taken years later, but it's the same cabinet. It used to stand catty corner in the corner of the living room, and they had put a crate in back of it. And they said, if it needs be, we might have to place you in back of the crate. I'm sure that it didn't have all that stuff that's on top of that picture, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to move it. So one day, someone came to the house, panicky, and said, someone is coming, someone is coming. They heard that you have someone here, a Jewish person. So really fast, they took me, moved the cabinet, put me on top of that crate. And the reason for the crate is if you look under that cabinet, you can see the legs there. They would be able to see two little feet if they didn't have the crate there. So they put me there and they said, now be quiet, don't make a sound, don't cough, don't cry, don't say anything. And I guessed that they had confidence in me. I was always good, so they knew I would be good. Meanwhile, their son, who was, like I told you, was about 17, he was also in danger because they wanted to take those people too, to take them to Germany. So he escaped. They had made, with other young people in the neighborhood, they had made like a bunker in the woods, and he went there. So I was back there, and pretty soon there was a loud knocking at the door. And my uncle and aunt went, and they opened the door, and there were these two guys in uniform screaming and yelling that they heard that there's a Jew there. And they kept on saying, no, no, no. And they put a gun to his head and said, yes, we know it from good authority that you do have a Jew here. They said no, and they kept screaming and yelling and that gun. And then the SS said to them, to my uncle, look, you better tell us because you're putting in danger your whole family. You see your daughters, your wife, all this will disappear. You won't have a house. You'll lose the house. You'll go to Germany, and who knows what will happen to the Jew will disappear, and it will be all for nothing. They kept on saying, no, no, and the screaming went on and on. Finally, they gave up, and they said, okay, let's see. We'll go and check it out. So they went to two of them, and they marched up to the attic. We had an attic where we slept, the girls and I, my sisters. And they went all over. Then they went into the basement and were checking and screaming and looking, and that gun, nothing. And I was quiet. And then they came into that room. They looked all over. And eventually, after a lot of yelling and screaming, they left. Then they left and we stayed quiet, didn't do anything. After a while, they moved the cabinet and took me out, and they said, oh, you did so well, and they were very happy. Then life proceeded, and there were lots of things that happened. We were in a neighborhood, bombs would fall. This is a picture that was taken during the war years, how I looked. And life went on, but we always had enough food. And yes, there were bombs that fell, but you know, if you was people that take care of you, everything is okay. And my hiding family loved me and was okay. I know that I don't have so much time, so I'm going a little fast. So then in November of 44, it was a very cold winter. The south, that part of the Netherlands where I was they were fighting, the British were there, and they were fighting, and they were liberated. But that was in November 44. And so we were free, but the rest of the country was still at war. And so for me, it was a very cold winter. I do remember that there was some skating that year that was unusual, this year too, that we're on the side of the road. There was some water that had frozen and people were skating there. But the war ended finally in 45. Now, I don't know exactly how, but suddenly they told me that someone was looking for me, that it might be my mother. My mother, meanwhile, as soon as she could, she left Switzerland. She was all those years in Switzerland. And she left and she made it. It was very difficult, but she made it back to where my aunt was. My aunt, like everyone else, also had to go in hiding because when Argentina finally went into the war against Germany, then they were a danger too, but they hid and they survived. So when my mother returned, she found my mother and she found my aunt, and my aunt, meanwhile, had found my sister, Eddie. And my mother was really happy to see them. And they said, oh, they were happy, they hugged and everything. And they said, but where is my older girl? And my aunt said, I don't know. And she told her the whole story. And she said, we lost sight of her. This is the picture of my aunt. So my mother said, well, what do I do now? And my mother had had this picture on her all during the war. And my mother said, well, what do I do? How do we find out? Now, remember, there were so many children and adults. It was big chaos, and everyone was looking for anyone. So she said, how in the world do I find her? So they decided to place this picture in the newspaper. But there were lots of people placing pictures, and there were lots of people looking. Didn't help. So my mother said to my aunt, what do I do now? So my aunt said, well, of course, we'll go to the underground. So they went to other people that she knew from the underground. They showed her my picture and they said, what do we do? So they looked at the picture and they could see by looking at me that I was the coffee. Remember, the coffee went to the south and the tea went to the north. So they gave her the address of the person that lived in the south of the country, not the area where I was, but in another province near there in the south. My mother found that house and she went there and she showed, she knocked at the door, she had gotten an address and said to the lady, oh, I'm looking for my daughter. And she showed her the picture and the lady said, don't worry, I know exactly where your daughter is. She is fine. So of course my mother was already happy. And somehow at my hiding place, they found out that my mother was looking for me. So they told me. And when they told me that my mother was coming, I was upset, but maybe I didn't want to hear about it. So one day, I come with my hiding sisters. We had gone to a celebration because it was the end of the war. And we came, and then my aunt said to me, Leni, that's what they called me, Leni, your mother is here. And my first reaction was I hid behind the skirt of my tante. That's what I called her, my aunt, my hiding mother. And I said, and so then this is my aunt, my tante. She was not my real aunt, but she was my hiding aunt. And I loved her. So I hid behind her and I didn't want to know anything of my mother. However, my mother was quite a resourceful person, not just beautiful. And she stayed here a couple of days and she tried to play with me and to make pictures and make me like her. And after 3 days, regardless of how I felt, she took me together with her to Amsterdam. It was not so easy traveling in those days, but somehow we made it. And I came to Amsterdam, met my aunt and uncle, my real aunt and uncle, who of course I didn't remember anything of all that. And they spoke a different language on top of that. They didn't speak dialect. They spoke like people in the city spoke, which to me was an embarrassment. And I met my sister, and slowly I started living there, met the rest of friends and family, the ones that were still alive, and we lived in Amsterdam. Now I started going to school there and was very, very unhappy at the school. all over at home. I wouldn't eat, and every day going to school, you had to go by the canals, and I would vomit, and I started coming out with sores again, and I was unhappy. But I didn't know it, that my mother, meanwhile, was in touch with my hiding family. You couldn't write telephone. There was no telephone where they lived. But of course, it was, you could write letters. So she wrote, and a few months later, and I didn't know that this was going to happen, I came home from school, and my two hiding sisters were there. And I was, of course, happy, and I'm not. And eventually they took, this was all arranged beforehand. They took me with them back to the farm, and I stayed there for a little while longer, a couple of months longer, and I started going to school there. I found later papers that I actually went to school there, that my name. And after a few months of living with them again, they told me, you cannot stay there here any longer. We want you, but your mother wants you too. Now, my mother, meanwhile, remarried and I had a little brother. And I started, this is a picture of my new father, and my mother had a new baby, my brother, who happens to live in California, and he's wonderful. And and we lived there. And by then, they made a deal with me on the farm. They said, you know what, you have to go back and live with your mother. However, whenever there's a vacation or a long holiday, you can come here and be with us. And that's how it was. So whenever there was a vacation, I would go there. Now, my sister went with me one time, met the farm, and liked that a lot. So from then on, whenever there was a holiday and I went, my sister went too. And I stayed there. I participated in a wedding there. I was the bridesmaid for, this was one of my hiding sister and her future husband. And I loved him very much. And I'll tell you later what happened after that. But as time went by, my new father, as a child, you do exactly what your parents or new parents tell you. And so we went to school in Amsterdam, but after a few years, my mother and stepfather decided to go to Argentina. They went with my brother. My sister and I followed half a year later or so. And then I lived in Argentina. I lived 5 years in Argentina, then 3 years in Brazil. And my husband, who he was part of the family because my mother was close friends with his sister, and my husband, he's the T in the story. Remember the ones that went to the north of the country? He was blonde, so he was in the north. So this is a picture that was taken after the war with myself and my husband. I'm on the other side too, with my husband and me and my sister-in-law and some local children that lived in that town. So we went to Argentina, then Brazil. My husband, meanwhile, after some years, came to America, and he then went into the army here, and he came to visit us in Brazil. We decided to get married, and I eventually followed him to the United States. Now, I do have here some documentation. This is in the Netherlands, they have a book with all the people that died during the war, and there are 108,000 names, I believe, in this book. The book only has names of people, their names, where they were born, and where they were killed. And if you can believe it, over 100,000 names, including my father and my husband's father and mother, they were all in there. We applied in Israel to Yad Vashem, and they instituted that in Israel, and a medal was given by Yad Vashem for the righteous among the living. And all my husband's family and our own were all recognized by Yad Vashem. And this is a picture of my aunt and uncle who were the righteous among the nation. And I think with that I conclude, and I hope I didn't go too long, that you still have some time for questions.
Leah, thank you so much for sharing this story with us this morning. And we do have some questions. The first question, somebody asked when you showed the photo of the shop, what the sign said above it.
Oh,
offhand, or do you have that photo?
yeah, I do. I'll tell you in a sec. It says, oh, the newest Viennese style. That was the advertising. And then it also said that they sell raincoats. Yeah, that's about it. But I was amazed that I think it was a cousin of mine that had that picture in Israel, and that's how I got that picture.
Oh, thank you for sharing. Did you ever find out who told the Nazis that you were hiding?
That betrayed us? No, I never found out anything. In fact, I think that you, Michael, once put me in touch with a British television production company that was going to help me find, they worked on finding people, but I think when they heard the story that they were not able to help me.
Right, yeah, I remember that from a few years ago.
Right.
Do you know, one of our viewers would like to know if you know anything about some Dutch citizens wearing a yellow star in support of the Jews. Do you know about that?
Of support? I know that they had to wear the Jewish star that just said Jew, but I don't know. Oh, that everyone wears it, like was it in Denmark?
Yeah,
No, I didn't do that in the Netherlands. I never heard anything like that.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Why did your sister get to live with the housekeeper, and why couldn't you stay as well?
Maybe it was a good thing I didn't, but to take one child was already a big deal. And then to have two, the less amount of people that they had, the better. It wasn't actually so good to have many adults all together or many children. If you had one, it was easier for people not to tell than more than one. Mike, oh, there you are.
Thank you very much. Also, I'd like to give a shout out. I believe your sister is actually watching on the other end.
Yeah, very possible. And her friend too.
Oh, well, we're glad to have you joining us. Thank you. How long did your mother stay in Switzerland? And do you know about her life while she was living there?
She lived in a camp. They separated people. When they came to the border, my mother had a hard time when she came to the border of Switzerland. She had a hard time getting it through because the soldiers there said that they do not accept any people that come without children. And my mother said, yeah, but I have children. But the soldiers said, well, but you don't have the children here, so we're not going to let you in. And they sent her to go down that mountain again. And as she was walking, and my mother was not one to accept no for an answer. She said no, and she went back up and tried it again. And all the people that were with her followed her. And she, through her charm and knowledge and not accepting no, they did let her come into the country because they said, well, just go back to where you came from. And she knew that if she came down those mountains, that the Nazis would be waiting for her, and that would be the end. While she was in Switzerland, she was in a work camp in Switzerland. She herself didn't think it was that bad because it was nothing like the camps that they had in Poland or Germany. She was glad that she survived. And as it turned out, she was lucky that her children survived.
Thank you. How did the decision come to go to Brazil? And what was that like to make that choice for your family?
I had somewhat of a complicated life. I went to Argentina, and of course, I had never been outside of Holland, and it was a new experience. I didn't, when we came to Argentina, my sister and I, my mother already had been there for about half a year with my little brother and stepfather. And I, by the way, both of us were adopted while we were in the Netherlands. So we had a new name. So when we came to Argentina, we started going to school, and in the beginning, we didn't speak any Spanish, but as a child, when they put you in a class and you're there and you don't understand anything, it's amazing how fast at that age you adapt and learn. And we stayed here 5 years. And the reason we didn't stay longer is that my mother, meanwhile, divorced her second husband and married their best friend. And we went to Brazil. And we went to Sao Paulo, Brazil. And when we came to Sao Paulo, and that's how come my sister lives there now. And unfortunately, my sister, normally she would come here once a year, and we do either go on vacation or do something together. But this year, because of the pandemic, everything is difficult. And it's worse for her than for me living in Brazil. But she stayed there so my husband came after he was in the army. He came to Brazil to visit. He asked me to marry him. And to me, he was an old friend, even though we hadn't seen each other for all those years during the war years. And then the time that we had been 5 years in Argentina. And he was 7 years older. So at that age, you change a lot from a child to a teenager and older. So I came to the United States. She stayed in Brazil. My brother eventually also came to Los Angeles. He lives here in La Cañada. And years later, my mother came too, and the only one that unfortunately stayed was my sister, and she has her family there. And in fact, my aunt and uncle that were originally that saved me, whose house I lived with, they moved to Argentina. And I still have a cousin living in Argentina. And I have family actually all over, and that happens with a lot of the survivors. So there is family in Australia, Israel, Argentina, Brazil, and here.
Thank you so much. Similar question. What languages do you speak?
I speak a few, but not as well as my sister. She does better than I do, but I do speak Dutch, and I speak Spanish and Portuguese and Spanish. And when we talk, our language is, especially with my sister, it gets quite confusing because we sort of mix it all up. But we understand each other. And one year we were on vacation, or it was on a cruise. We were in the Caribbean, we were in Curacao, and we discovered there a language that was made just for us. It was a combination of Dutch, I think it was Portuguese and Spanish, no, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese, maybe, but it was funny.
Thank you. Going back to the Holocaust years, do you remember what games or what you would like to do with your hiding family, with your hiding sisters? Anything that stood out that you remember doing with them for fun?
Well, they didn't have children, so I did have make some friends, neighbor friends after the war, but being with them was always special. I adored them. They were always wonderful to me. And I sort of played in the house. I have a store, and I would use newspapers and things like that. I remember that house. We didn't even have a bathroom. There was a bathroom, but it's like going here when you go to the parks and you have an outdoor bathroom. It was different. We didn't have any of the conveniences, but somehow as a child, and if you're loved, and I love being there. And now, all these years later, I forgot to tell you that I'm still in touch with my hiding family. The husband of one of the sisters died a year ago at 100, but I'm still in touch with the grandchildren and the great grandchildren. And they will be forever in my thoughts, and I loved them. And they were exceptional people, because the amount of people, you hear us survivors speak and say we were saved by this or that, but it was very few people that were willing to take a child or an adult. And it's understandable. You take care of your own first, and having food at the farm, it was not a problem. It was, if you were in the city, that was a big problem. And my family never, ever accepted any money. And they said to my mother when she returned, she said, no, they didn't want any money. And they also said that they never considered converting me. And she said the only time that they would have done that is if suddenly I would have gotten very, very ill and I would die, then they would call for the priest, but otherwise they would leave me as a Jew.
Thank you very much. Do you know what happened to your family's shop?
I do not, but no, I do not. The building doesn't exist anymore. And no, I do not know anything. It's my mother, she did return after the war. When she returned, she went into that apartment or house where we lived, because she didn't have anything and it was hard to buy or get anything. And she went to that apartment and she knocked at the door and she said, you have furniture of mine and I need stuff. And they said, no, we don't have anything. And somehow she called the police, and the police came up with her and said, what is yours here? And she pointed at certain things, and the people returned whatever she pointed to. And most of the things we had, of course, all disappeared.
Thank you for sharing that. Do you remember at what point you and your family found out your father's fate?
I think my mother found out before she left for Switzerland that she was told that he had died of a heart attack, but we didn't know the whole story. And actually, it was only like 2 years ago that we found out that there was a professor in the Netherlands that was looking for my father's family. And now I found out that there was a professor and she did a major research and has pictures of all these 400 men. And remember, this was the first raid that they had in the Netherlands. And she has the story exactly what happened. I've not seen the book, but I do want to get my hands on that book. And they did discover some of the people that they found their children from the pictures they recognized. And I had a letter from one of my nieces, yes, that's she didn't know, I guess, about my father. And my niece said to me, oh, so when my grandson's grandfather was one of those taken during that raid. And she doesn't know that my father was still in those 400 men.
Thank you. When did you first start to share your story publicly?
Okay, when I was in the United States, and for us, talking about the Holocaust came sort of easy because my husband, and his name was Alex, his hiding family originally lived here in Artesia. They had a dairy farm, and we would go visit them. And he also knew my hiding family. And maybe because it didn't seem as hard to share those stories as the stories of people that actually have been in the killing camps. We always talked about it, but we never thought anything special of it. And one night, someone called on the telephone, and it happened to be Sarah Moskowitz, who was a professor and doing a lot of studies and worked with a lot of child survivors. And she called here and she said, it was for Alex, and she said, would he be willing to take a tape? She was at that time a professor at CSUN, and she was taping for the Yale Library. And she wanted to tape his story. And he said, but I have nothing to tell. And she said, well, I would like to do that. So he decided, after he consulted me, decided to do that. And he went to CSUN and he taped the story. And that's when he first met other survivors. But we never thought that we were real survivors, because in our mind, a real survivor, you had to be in a concentration camp. Now, years later, we realized that, God forbid, if they would take a grandchild of mine and do this to a grandchild, that this is not normal and that this is a trauma. But we at the time thought that we were just like everyone else. I can tell you now that when I look at myself, my confidence and all that, that it's nothing like other people, that this will always be there and that I am different. But so it was through Sarah Moskowitz, and there is a plaque from her and from Flo Kinsler, who worked with Sarah, telling the story that through them we formed a group and that we have our own child survivors. And now I feel that it is not only my duty, but I hope that people that we can tell as many people as possible what happened to us, and that they will go on telling these stories, that these stories will not be forgotten, and that people can make a difference and making the world better and hoping that these things will never happen again.
Thank you so much. When did you tell your own children and your family about your experiences, even if you spoke to others about it later on?
We always did. It was no big deal. We went to the hiding family of Alex, and we actually only talked about the funny things or the happy things that happened to us. And they knew from little that their parents had been in hiding during the war. They didn't know exactly all the stories. And I know that one year, maybe it was the first year, we went back to the Netherlands, and I went with my husband. My son came with us. We went to visit my hiding family, and we were there for the day. And on our return, my husband said, you know, I always thought you were exaggerating when you said all the fuss, when you talked, the way you talked about them. But they really were all that you said, and the love that they showed, and how they missed you, that it was a wonderful thing to see. And now, when I think about it, I think that it was a very difficult thing what we did to those hiding families, that they had taken such good care of us, and they really loved us, and we loved them. And then they just took us away from there. Yeah, they maybe said thank you, but this had been their child now for all those years, and we were gone. And for them, this must have been traumatic too.
Thank you very much. And how many children and grandchildren do you have?
I have two children, a son and a daughter, Karen Radziner and Ronald Radziner. And Ronald has two grandchildren, a granddaughter, Lexi, named after Alex, and Asher, a grandson. And that's wonderful. And it's incredible that how things turned out. And we're very, very lucky with everything living here. And I must say that the museum has been a tremendous comfort to a lot of us. And like I said before, I hope that people will remember and keep telling our stories, that they will not be forgotten.
Thank you so much. And to conclude, what would you like for people to take away from hearing your story and your family's story? What would you like people to take away from this experience?
I hope that it made a difference hearing this story, and that they will remember, and that because there are so many deniers nowadays that say that it's not true, that they believe that it's true, and that they will repeat our stories to others. And also, I hope that they themselves, whether they're immigrant from another country nowadays, that they will ask their grandparents and write it down. Try to write your own story, because your story is powerful too. It's just different. And what happened to the Jews, it's terrible, terrible. And it probably is. I'm not saying that but the other stories that they have to tell in their own rights are powerful and worthwhile. And it would be a wonderful memory that they can leave to their children and grandchildren.
Thank you so much. We have people who are watching in the audience just thanking you for sharing your story. One comment says, Leah's resilience and her mother's resilience is beyond amazing. She has experienced so much and yet has gone on with her life and shared her story. Leah, thank you so much for not only for sharing your story today, but for everything you've done for our museum and our community by sharing your story many times over the years and participating in our educational programs. Thanks to you and our other speakers, students from around the city and country and even the world in some instances, have learned about this history from you, and they will always carry the memories of your story and of listening to you in this experience. So we thank you so much. And of course, we wish you a happy Passover, and everybody who celebrates, have a happy and meaningful Passover. And we thank you all for listening this afternoon, and we hope to welcome everyone to the museum in person when it's safe to open. In the meantime, please follow our website and our social media for our upcoming virtual programs. Thank you so much.